Good evening and welcome to another edition of Maclean's Live. Obviously not live. It's not actually supernaturally bright here on a weeknight evening at the Wells household. We just taped this early to be on the safe side. And I admit that I'm feeling a little introspective because our next guest, tonight's guest, was actually our first guest in February of 2018, nearly 3 years ago. Jagmeet Singh launched this series of conversations with Canadian newsmakers at the National Arts Centre in February of 2018. And he had a lot to do with this series even existing. He was the new leader of the NDP at that point. I didn't know much about him. I figured I would sit down with him, and I thought we might as well have an audience while we did it. For all of that, not quite 3 years, our sponsor for these conversations has been the Canadian Bankers Association. And as we always do, we thank them for making these conversations possible. I thank you for watching at home, and I'm grateful and happy to have our next guest joining us. He's the leader of Canada's New Democratic Party, Jagmeet Singh, and he joins us from a smashing set. Where is that, in your office, Mr. Singh?
This is in my parents' home where I'm quarantining in Brampton.
Oh, really? Okay. Quarantining to be on the safe side, I hope.
Yes. Just because it's one of those times where there's lockdowns going on, and so my wife and I just chose to stay in one spot and limit our contact. And this is where we're going to be. My parents are older, and so I want to support them, take care of them.
Very good. And I think a lot of us are in the same boat. Before we get into a bunch of heavy newsy subjects, I'm just curious what you're going to do with the few weeks of downtime that we all have ahead of us.
Yeah, it's been really a confusing time, hey Paul, for a lot of folks. I've been thinking about what this means and what we've been going through, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to just spending time with family and appreciating the things that I'm really lucky to have. I'm lucky to have an amazing partner and my mom and dad in my life, and my brother, my sister-in-law. So we're all just going to spend quality time together. I know it's going to be different, that we're not going to be able to see our friends and our extended family, but we're just going to spend a lot of time, hopefully read a lot of books. I had a bunch of books on my list that I'm looking forward to reading, and just spend that time.
What's on your list?
Well, I've got the Obama book. I think that's going to be an interesting one. I have a number of fantasy books that I'm really interested in. Abercrombie as an author. I just finished Station 11, which was a fantastic read. Culture Code is a book that I've been enjoying as well. It talks about how to build good culture in the workplace. So yeah, a number of books that I have. I think I have a stack of like 6 or 7. Those are just the highlights, but a whole bunch.
Well, this is always the best time to catch up. I have been grinding through Robert Caro's multi-volume Life of Lyndon Johnson, and I am just about desperate to finish the 3rd volume and get it behind me. So I'm hoping I can deal with that this holiday. When we come back, the eternal question of any minority parliament faces itself, which is, you sort of can't get past it. Whenever I try and report on actual stuff, the first question from an audience is, but when's the election? So I might as well ask you, are we going to have an election in 2021?
Well, that is a question on a lot of people's mind. I can tell you that we are ready to fight an election whenever there is. It has not been my goal, though, to find an excuse to go to an election. What I've been doing and what my team has been doing is using the leverage we have to make some differences for people, to fight for the help that people need. That's been our focus. So if there's an election, it's certainly not going to be because New Democrats are looking for one. But what we've seen in the past very recently, it looked like the Liberals were finding an excuse for an election. So it's really in the Prime Minister's ball court if that's what he wants to do. But again, my focus is on finding ways to make government work for people.
Let me give you a chance to enumerate the ways in which you've done that. Because honestly, in the press gallery, sometimes you say, Jagmeet Singh says he's been able to get concessions out of the government, but we don't see them. Feel free to correct me.
Well, certainly, we in a lot of ways have been probably one of the most effective oppositions in the history of our country, particularly in recent memory in this generation. We doubled CERB. That was absolutely something we fought and achieved. We were able to secure help for students. That was not something that was planned for. The Canadian Emergency Student Benefit was a concession we fought and obtained and won for people. We were able to increase the wage subsidy to 75%. It started off at 10%. We got it to 75%. There were multiple times when the Liberals were going to cut off CERB. Throughout the summer, we saw multiple opportunities where they were looking to cut it off. We fought back and made it a requirement of our support that CERB continue. And then most recently, for the first time in the history of our country, at the federal level, we fought and obtained paid sick leave. This has never existed at the federal level, and it is the first new social safety net in a generation in Canada that we were able to fight and secure. These are just some of the wins on top of the ones that we pushed for the rent subsidy to change. We fought for help for seniors. We fought for help for people living with disabilities, and obtained wins on all those files. But those are I think the big four, big five.
Okay, has that paid sick leave been implemented yet?
It has. It is available. People are applying for it. It is something that we fought to include COVID as well as COVID-like symptoms. So right now, if someone is facing COVID or COVID-like symptoms, and they don't want to make that impossible choice between going to work sick and risking infecting their colleagues, or staying at home but not having any pay and not being able to pay their bills, right now they can go on the Government of Canada website and apply for the benefit that is paid sick leave. It's available for Canadians right now.
Sounds like you prefer a minority parliament to a majority parliament. You can have much more influence in this circumstance than you normally can.
Well, my goal is just how can we get things done for people? And really that focus on people is what has driven our victories for people. We've really looked at this pandemic and thought, well, what are people going through? The paid sick leave was really, we looked at the struggles that people are facing. We spoke with people who are saying, well, when I get sick and I've got symptoms that feel like COVID, I'm not going to stay at home, even though that's the directive, if I can't pay the bills. Like if the choice is between groceries and food on the table or staying at home and not going to work, well, I'm not going to choose to give up on the necessities that my family has. So we've looked at that and said, well, we need to then give people the opportunity to stay at home. And so really this minority government has been an opportunity for us to look at what people are struggling with and find ways to secure some real help for them.
Okay. I've been wondering in a couple different ways how Parliament is different now than it was before the election. And you you got elected in a by-election shortly before the last election. You spent some time in Parliament in both circumstances. I'm wondering how the minority compares to the majority and how reduced COVID Parliament compared to showing up for work before March.
Well, lots of big differences for sure. One of the major things is we have a leverage right now that if the Liberal government wants to pass legislation in the House, they need at least one other party to support them. And throughout the pandemic, we have found ways to be the partner in order to fight for the changes that we want to see happen. So we've fought and got real victories for people. And that is because we had the platform, the opportunity to do so. And I've realized that more New Democrats would mean more opportunities to fight for people and to secure those wins. The difference with the hybrid and the in-person, it certainly takes away a little bit of the experience when you're in the House of Commons in question period, having all 338 members. There's a certain feeling to that, certainly. But I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to come up with this hybrid parliament solution for a lot of people in communities that are at high risk or that are facing lockdowns. It is dangerous to travel between a lockdown community and then traveling to Ottawa, which is right now, the numbers aren't as bad. So in a lot of ways, this was a very prudent thing to do. It was a safe thing to do. And it gave a lot of people the opportunity to participate and be a voice for their communities who otherwise would not have been able to go to Ottawa. So I think it's been really effective. It certainly feels different, but it's been, I think, a good solution in these difficult times.
Okay. I'm not as excited by various hypotheticals about election timing as other people are, but I know that other people are watching, and so maybe you'll humor me for just another couple rounds on this. Say the House comes back at the end of January, there's a budget the first week of February, and there's something terrible, horrible, and the opposition can't stand it, and y'all vote against it. We're in an election, before Easter. Are you ready? Do you have a platform to put to people? Do you have all the logistics lined up, or is the first half of that campaign going to be swallowed up with the parties doing the work that they normally do before an election campaign starts?
I really appreciate the question. No, we're ready. I'm really proud to announce. I can announce it here on your show on this interview. we are going to pay off not just our 2019 campaign election, but also what was remaining on the 2015 campaign election. That will be paid off. It should be paid off momentarily. This month, it will be paid off. So we'll be in a great position with no campaign debt, ready to fight an election. We've already struck a committee. Because we're in a minority, we knew that this eventuality of an election could happen at any moment. So we already have a committee up and running, doing election work, and we have our campaign platform in the works. It will be ready very shortly. So we're ready. Again, I don't want to find an excuse to go to an election, but if there is a need to fight one, we will be ready with a better position going into this election than the last 2019 campaign. And I'm really proud of the work that my team has done, that we've done together to be in this position.
How did you pay off that debt?
Well, it was a lot of hard work, a lot of fundraising. We obtained a lot of support from people, and we made a really good plan. In 2019, we made a plan that we wanted to be election ready right away. And we put together a great plan, great work from my national director, Melissa Bruno, great work from my chief of staff, Jennifer Howard, and we all got together and made a plan and executed it. And on top of that, Canadians saw that we were fighting for them through this pandemic. And though it's been difficult for people have been hard hit financially, they were still very generous with their support. And I'm really thankful that we're in this position to not have just paid off our own 2019 campaign debt, but even the previous campaign debt from 2015. Altogether, it'll be all paid off this month.
How much money is that?
Just over $10 million was our campaign debt, just about between $10 and $11 million. So we're all paid off this month.
Wow. Well, the goal of these interviews is not to make news, but I think that's news. So thanks for helping us out on that.
It is, in fact, yeah. It's exciting, and I'm happy to share it here. But yeah, that is definitely big news. We were really excited once I got the report. We knew we were on track, and we were kind of playing our cards close. But then our national director, who is Anne McGrath, who is very conservative with releasing good news, she wanted to be very certain. And as soon as we were certain, she gave me the big news, and I was really excited. Wow,
that's really extraordinary. Now on to business that affects folks at home maybe a bit more than folks here in the bubble or the virtual bubble. That new platform. I have a bit of sympathy for political parties that need to be ready for an election barely a year after the last one. Obviously, circumstances have changed. How has your pitch to Canadians changed as a function of those changing circumstances?
Well, I think more than ever, Canadians are worried about healthcare. And as a party that is steeped in the tradition of healthcare being public, being accessible, being a priority, it is very much in line with our values. So a lot of what we talked about in the last campaign rolls over. It's even more relevant than ever. As Canadians lost their jobs, they also lost their benefits. So many Canadians lost their coverage for their teeth, dental care. They lost their coverage for purchasing medication. So more than ever, pharmacare and dental care are really important and will play prominently in our platform. We also know that there's a big concern around who's going to pay for this pandemic. And that is something that is a very legitimate concern that Canadians have raised. So we have put forward a number of ideas that will show up also in our campaign platform about making the wealthiest, the ultra-rich, pay their fair share. And we're looking at the choice. Someone's got to pay for this pandemic. Should it be the working class family that has struggled through this pandemic? Should it be the small business that shut their doors and is worried about never opening again? Or should it be the large web giants that have made massive, in fact, record profits? Should it be the large corporations that have seen incredible profits during this pandemic? Should it be the ultra wealthy, 44 Canadian billionaires who made over $53 billion in new wealth over this pandemic? I believe the ultra wealthy should pay their fair share, and we've got a plan to ask for that to happen. So a plan that looks at who's going to pay for the pandemic and the recovery, as well as a focus on healthcare and the social safety net, and a recovery that focuses on people and getting people back to work while we fight the climate crisis.
Okay. Some elements of that sound familiar. Getting the ultra wealthy to pay, if I recall, would be very similar to your last platform. The web giants, that strikes me as something new.
Yeah, well, we talked about it in the last campaign, but we want to give more attention to it, particularly since the Liberal government made an announcement about applying the GST that is not actually going to solve the problem. The problem is that that is a tax that goes to the consumer. It's not actually making sure the wealthiest pay their fair share. And with web giants, we've got companies like Facebook, Netflix, Google that have made record profits in this pandemic that pay virtually no tax in Canada. That has got to end. And we look at other countries like France that put in place a 3% tax on the revenue generated in the country as a really clear solution. So we'll be fleshing out this idea much more, given that it is even more so important to make sure those who make profits off of Canadians pay taxes in Canada.
Okay. There were two big events last week that I'd like to get your reaction to, because they follow on this conversation. First of all, there was a virtual First Ministers meeting, Prime Minister and the Premiers. They've been doing regular sort of conference calls, but this was specifically about healthcare and the Premier's demand for really substantial new increases to health transfers. Prime Minister basically said, I'll get back to you later. What do you make of that meeting?
Well, I think that this is vital. The healthcare transfers have gone down year over year. The relationship used to be a 50-50 between the federal government and the provinces, which meant that healthcare was funded. So if your loved one needed care, the care was there. But now over the years, that what used to be 50-50 is now eroded to 78% at the provincial level and only 22% at the federal level. That means that provinces have been starved of funding, and that has directly meant that patient care, access to the healthcare resources that people need has gone down. So the demand pretty unanimously amongst all premiers to increase healthcare funding transfers is very fair. We absolutely support it. And we think that we can couple the increased healthcare funding with pharmacare and other programs that'll reduce our costs, because when people can afford medication, they don't get as sick, they can maintain their health and not get to an extreme stage of an illness, which is more costly. So liberal and conservative cuts that have brought us to this position have to be reversed. Harper brought in cuts that Prime Minister Trudeau has continued. We have to stop those cuts. We've got to invest in healthcare.
Would provincial agreement to implement the new programs that you're describing be a condition of getting that increased transfer funding?
Well, I think that the Canada Health Act principles should continue, and they should govern our transfers as they have. And I think we need to look at ways of including other things. The long-term care homes has been one of the worst impacts of COVID-19. We've seen it directly impact seniors. They're the most vulnerable, and we've seen some deplorable conditions in long-term care. What's also been identified is that for-profit homes have been where the worst conditions have happened. So a transfer of public money to provinces, which is absolutely appropriate, many people would say would not be appropriate if it was going to a for-profit long-term care home that spent that public money on paying out their shareholders, paying out dividends. So to prevent that from happening, there's got to be clear restrictions in place that public money goes to care for our seniors, goes to care for those in need. So those type of agreements should be there. And I'm confident we can achieve those. I think all Canadians would agree public healthcare money should go towards healthcare.
The other thing that, I mean, I could spend the entire rest of the hour debating that, but we've got a lot to cover. And one of the other things that happened last week was that the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, put some meat on the bones of their net zero emission commitment for 2050. And there's a whole lot of measures that they announced, and I welcome you to comment on any of them, but the one that was really striking was the plan to accelerate the increase in the carbon tax so that the value of the carbon tax triples to $170 per ton by 2030. What do you make of that?
Well, putting a price on pollution is pretty clear. There is a cost to pollution. It hurts us in the short term and in the long term. So putting a cost on it makes sense, and increasing that cost makes sense. But I've got a couple of key concerns. One is the Liberals haven't addressed the fact that even with their existing carbon tax, the biggest polluters are left off the hook, essentially paying virtually no tax. There's exemptions up to 90% for some of the biggest polluters. So I don't see how we can achieve our goals if the biggest polluters are exempt from the Liberal plan. That's not really a plan to get us to the result that we want. And the second piece that I'm worried about is I don't want the burden of fighting the climate crisis to fall on workers' shoulders. It shouldn't fall on people that are struggling. There needs to be clear supports in place so workers have a clear alternative, that there is accessibility with respect to electric vehicles, that it's something that people can afford, and that there are charging stations. So it's actually a real option for a family to choose an electric vehicle over a combustion engine vehicle. There's got to be real choice there that supports workers to make that decision. And the burden shouldn't be on working people. It should be on the biggest polluters. And those are the two big concerns that I see that have not been addressed with the Liberal plan.
Okay. The mechanism that the Liberals have put forward to deal with cost on the carbon taxes, their rebate program, which benefits most consumers. It's a net benefit. Most people get more in the rebates than they pay in the carbon tax. As long as that rebate scheme keeps pace with increases in the tax, is that acceptable to you?
Well, the rebate scheme, in fairness, is something that does work to provide some fairness and some balance in the carbon tax. But my concern is twofold. One is, again, this doesn't address the fact that the biggest polluters are getting off the hook. That's a big concern. And secondly, my question is about choice. So if we want a family to make the right decisions around lowering their energy usage, well, we need to make it easier for families to then retrofit their homes, for example. So we've got a plan that would couple these type of decisions with investments in allowing families and homes to retrofit to reduce their energy costs, their heating costs. That way we can actually encourage the behavior or encourage the choices that'll actually help protect our planet and save money for families, lower their energy costs. So those are the things I think that are missing in this plan. The rebate only approach without the way or the supports to get families to be able to reduce their energy consumption with those retrofits, I think is a gap in the Liberal proposal.
A lot of supporters, especially a lot of climate activists who've been urging more action from this government, say that their ambitious emissions agenda is incompatible with owning a pipeline. Does Trans Mountain have to go?
From the beginning, we said that this was a bad decision. And as we're seeing more and more evidence, it doesn't look like this is going to provide a real job stimulus. The amount of money that's going into the project more and more is raising concerns about whether that money would have been better spent directly investing in jobs in Alberta or in the oil and gas sector in terms of creating new jobs that are long lasting. We know that there are significant issues with commodity prices. That will mean that for the foreseeable future, there is not the same robust future in this sector, even just economically, putting aside the environmental impacts. And so for the sake of those workers, we need to make better decisions. And that means investing directly in creating good jobs. Some of the examples that we've looked at are when we look at some of the abandoned oil wells, that they can be retrofitted to protect the environment, but also converted into things like geothermal plants, creating the jobs to maintain and to transform those sites environmentally, but also to create energy in the future. So we've got to look at ways that directly create jobs. And I'm concerned that this project is one that as you know, Paul, I've been opposed to in the beginning, but more and more we're seeing it, there's not even an economic case for it.
Okay. You're just never going to get asked a question about Trans Mountain without also getting asked a question about the LNG project in British Columbia that is championed by Premier Horgan, the new Democratic Party Premier of British Columbia. Would you make the same arguments about that LNG project?
Well, there's clearly a strong financial case, so that argument doesn't flow the same way it does in terms of attacking the Trans Mountain project, which does not have a strong economic case. There is a very strong commitment on the part of the BC NDP to fight the climate crisis. They've got one of the, if not the best environmental plans in North America to reduce their emissions. And I'm confident that the BC NDP cares deeply and have laid out a plan for them to reduce their emissions and to keep this project within their plan. I think there's some stark differences between that project and Trans Mountain, absolutely.
Okay. Part of the fun of this series is sometimes I get to ask questions. I have no idea what your answer might be. Until August, the finance minister was Bill Morneau. Since August, it's been Chrystia Freeland. Have you noticed the difference?
Well, not really. I do have to acknowledge, though, that politics aside, Chrystia Freeland is certainly a very remarkable member of parliament and minister and has a very strong voice, and I can acknowledge that. But in terms of the policies, we are still concerned that the burden has been falling on working people. And there's not a willingness to change that. You know, the Liberals will talk about the beginning of their mandate that they made some changes to increase taxes on the 1%. But we're talking about real massive wealth. We're talking about the 44 billionaires in Canada that increased their wealth by $53 billion during the pandemic. We're talking about the pandemic profiteering, looking at those companies that have not just made profits in the pandemic, but record profits. And there's still an unwillingness to say very clearly that we should have the ultra rich paying their fair share, that we need to close the offshore tax havens, the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, that make it really clear that there are Canadians, the wealthiest, that are hiding their money with the sole goal of just not paying their taxes. That has to end. We know that there's massive concerns about web giants not paying their taxes in Canada. That has to end. And we need to make sure there's a tax on wealth. People who've got fortunes of over 20 million should be paying their fair share. These are things that we've proposed, and Finance Minister Morneau was certainly opposed to, was not interested in. And it doesn't look that Minister Freeland is interested in those things. So to me, that represents the same kind of course of action. Not willing to tax the ultra wealthy will mean that burden is going to fall on working people.
Moving off of strictly economic topics and getting onto some of the other topics that have bedeviled this Parliament. One of them is the detention and trial of Meng Wanzhou. And it seems like every once in a while, one of your members of Parliament, first Don Davies and then Nikki Ashton, have argued that she's not being held on legitimate grounds and that Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, should simply be let go and sent back to China. And that if we're lucky, that would help to free the two Michaels. You haven't always agreed with that argument. What do you think? What do you make of it now?
Well, my focus on this, I just have to take a moment to acknowledge how worried I am about Mr. Spavor and Mr. Korvik, how their families have been so worried for these past 2 years. These are Canadians. They need to be supported. They need to be returned home. And so I'm really worried about that. In terms of how we get there, I have not taken that position. I think that we need to do whatever we can, though, to apply pressure, working with international communities, building a stronger and firmer position on some of the human rights violations going on in China, but specifically fighting to return these two Canadians home. Like, that has got to be our top priority.
More generally, China has seemed in so many ways like an increasingly belligerent force on the world stage. And the outgoing US president, Donald Trump, in some ways didn't really help by picking a massive, never-ending trade war with China. What would your advice be to the foreign minister and to the prime minister regarding relations with China in 2021? And what would your advice be to them with regard to relations with the incoming president, Joe Biden, in 2021?
Well, on as Paul, as you know, I'm very open to criticizing the Liberal government where I think there's criticism merited. On the China file, I do acknowledge that it's complicated and difficult, so I'll acknowledge that. I think we do need to be firmer, though. And by firmer, I think that we can do more to work with the international community in a collaborative way to really expressing some serious concerns about the human rights violations going on in the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. The stifling of that democratic spirit is something that we should absolutely be firm on. The treatment of the Uyghur is something we have to be very firm on. These are human rights violations, and we support the international community and the United Nations acknowledging that what's happening to Uyghurs is tantamount to genocide. So we need to be firm on those things. With respect to the new administration, I think we have an opportunity to have a better partnership. There seems to be more predictability with the Biden administration, which is something that we would welcome. I think in these uncertain times, we do need predictability and the ability to work together. So I think it's encouraging. My advice would be really with China, we need to be more firm. We need to use the tools we have at the international level to have a collaborative approach with international partners. And we need to work more closely with the United States with respect to whatever we can do to return Canadians that are the two Canadians that have been detained. We need to focus on that. And as our biggest trading partner, we need to certainly leverage that position, that relationship, and see what we can do to help those Canadians out.
Why do you suppose members of your caucus keep taking a different position with regard to Meng Wanzhou?
There's a lot of frustration, I think, that people have felt with respect to Canadians that have been kept in custody for 2 years, and there's a frustration that means that people are saying, well, what are the tools available? Like, let's look at everything possible. And I understand that frustration. I'm frustrated that these are two Canadians that have been kept in really horrible conditions, and we've read the conditions that Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kubrick have been through, being detained in a room with light on 24 hours and limited access to consular services. It's been really worrisome. I've been very worried. And so we've got to take a firmer position. I think we've got to take a firm position. It's clear that we need to have diplomacy, relationships, and communications with other countries are vital. I don't promote in any way shutting down communication. I think we need to be firm, but I think we also need to make sure we're working in a way that is achieving our goals, which is firmly and clearly to secure the release of these two Canadians.
It's extraordinary that I've gotten as far into this interview as I have without asking about the biggest story of the year, the issue that's on everyone's mind, which is this COVID epidemic. And it's almost hard to figure out where to start on this. Let's start with the beginning. Does this government have questions to answer about its management of public health before the outbreak that might have contributed to Canada being taken a bit by surprise by this outbreak?
I think that's becoming clear, that there were decisions that were not taken that should have been taken early on. And I'm looking at some of the quarantine restrictions on traveling, and when travelers did arrive, stricter quarantines to ensure that there was no spread of the infection. It's clear that there were some mistakes made, absolutely, in the beginning. We're really proud, though, that as a party and as leader, we were able to fight to get help for Canadians really quickly. There were still a number of Canadians that were left behind and were forgotten about, but we were there fighting for them. And we're really proud of the work that was done early on to get help to Canadians, direct financial support to people in need. So that's something that I think is a positive sign. We responded in a way to help Canadians out. But yes, there's clearly some serious concerns around public health and missteps taken by the Liberal government.
When you talk about quarantine, I remember there was some essentially confusion at airports, and people were not at all fully informed about how they were supposed to behave in the first months. And the mayor of Montreal, the premier of Alberta, actually sent their own officials to airports. Is that what you were talking about? Or would you rather, would you have preferred stricter quarantines against flights coming from different countries and things like that?
International travel, I think, was what was identified off the bat, that international travel in the beginning is how the spread happened in Canada. And there wasn't a strong approach to ensuring that people who did come in during the pandemic, when it was first starting, that there was stricter rules around limiting contact for those that came in from international flights when the pandemic first struck. And there's, I think, mounting evidence that would have helped slow the spread in the beginning. And then some of the other things, the wage subsidy, I think, was a great way to give direct financial support to keep people employed. But it took a long time, and it was only at 10% until we fought to bring it to 75%. I think that was a misstep. And the paid sick leave, that could have been done months and months ago. We had fought to secure the commitment on paid sick leave very early in the pandemic, but the Liberal government was slow in enacting it. And I think there is a clear connection that workplace transfer, people that were sick at work, that has been one of the things that public health experts have said has been one of the major causes of the spread. If we had paid sick leave in place earlier, as we had fought for, that would have prevented people from, or it would have encouraged people to stay at home when they were sick, and it would have lessened the spread. So I think those are some really key things that could have happened that would have really helped us out.
There's a cost to all of these measures. Total federal spending doubled this year from last year. That's never happened in Canada outside of the depths of wartime. Is it possible for spending to get out of control, even in understandable circumstances like these?
Oh, I am concerned that we're spending a lot. And I think it's merited, though. It's absolutely necessary. If we don't put supports in place, we'll see the K-shaped recovery continue. And that's where the wealthiest don't actually face any struggles. They actually increase their wealth. And we've got lots of evidence about that. And then we've got small businesses, workers that are actually hurting and their position is worse. They're tapping into their savings, or they're losing their life savings in businesses that have been forced to shut down. So if we don't put in supports, that K-shaped recovery will continue, and there'll be those that continue to amass massive wealth and those that lose their savings and are in worse conditions. So I believe that we've got to invest. But this is where that choice comes in, Paul, what I mentioned. We need to make sure those who have the capacity and the ability to pay their fair share are doing so. And I can't imagine anyone answering this question in any other way. Out of this pandemic, workers shouldn't have to pay for this. Families shouldn't have to be the ones that pay for this. Small businesses certainly are not in a position to pay for this. But there are a lot of companies and the wealthiest Canadians that are in a position to contribute. They should be the ones that do so. And if we look at that revenue side, I think we can then have more confidence in our ability to continue those programs that are essential. But without that revenue question being answered, the burden is going to fall on workers, and that is wrong, and that should not happen.
It sounds like the big difference between you and the Liberals is that you both agree on the spending side, but that unlike Justin Trudeau, you're also looking for new revenue to pay for some of that spending.
Absolutely, and we're specifically looking at new revenue from those who have the best capacity to pay that new revenue. That is a really big difference. The other major difference is that we believe a lot of these programs should become permanent. It shouldn't ever be a question that if you're sick in Canada, that you have to make the impossible choice. Do I go into work sick, or do I stay at home and not know if I can pay my bills at the end of the month? That should never be a question. So the big difference is we believe right now is a time to invest in a better social safety net that is more robust and is there for Canadians in the eventuality, as many experts are saying, of another potential pandemic in the future. If we are better prepared now and we have a better and more robust social safety net, a more invested in healthcare system that takes care of us better, we will come out of these difficult times better.
So if I wanted to get a lot of angry emails from readers who were telling me I'm crazy, I would say that the NDP leader sounds more fiscally responsible than the Liberal leader. Is that a part of your intended messaging?
Well, my focus is I want to spend money on people, and I want the ultra wealthy to pay for it. So, I mean, if that's the message that folks are hearing, I'm happy for them to hear it. I do believe we need to be responsible. I understand the fears that people have. Like when you look at its deficit, the reason why people are afraid is they're thinking that, well, does that mean I'm going to have to pay for it? And that's a legit fear because it has happened in the past. Previous Liberal and Conservative governments haven't had the courage to ask the wealthiest to pay. They put the burden through increased taxes on everyday people. That's wrong. And I'm saying right now, we cannot go down that path, particularly when we see Amazon and Walmart and Netflix and the big banks with massive profits. They posted record profits. They should be the ones that contribute more, not the people that have struggled. And yeah, I want that to be very clear. I take the debt and deficit very seriously, and there is a better way to move forward, and that is by making sure the ultra wealthy pay their fair share.
Okay. Justin Trudeau is not the only party leader you have to worry about in a crowded political landscape. There's also a new Conservative leader, Aaron O'Toole, and he lately talks a lot about how interested he is in increasing union membership and attracting the support of union members. That's traditional NDP territory. Are you worried?
Well, I would be worried if it wasn't for the fact that we've got a clear track record. This is the same Aaron O'Toole who was a minister in the Harper government that cut healthcare, that right now we're seeing the impacts of those cuts to healthcare. This is the same Aaron O'Toole that on one hand talks about workers, but in this pandemic can point to nothing that they've actually done to secure any help for Canadians. Like there is nothing that either the Liberal, the Conservatives, or the Bloc can point to that they actually fought for and obtained for Canadians, where we can list off so many victories for Canadians. It's clear the Conservatives have been more busy playing games maybe, or posturing, rather than actually working to get something done for Canadians. We've been the ones that have been leading the agenda with doubling the CERB, with bringing in paid sick leave, with fighting back the cuts to CERB that the Liberals were bringing in, with bringing in support for students. We're the ones that fought and brought these in. We've made more support available to more Canadians when the Conservatives and the Bloc haven't done that. They just simply have been absent in leadership fighting for people. They just haven't done it. So while he can say the words, there's really no proof to substantiate that.
I was thinking a little bit about how 2021 will be different from 2019. Let's just forget that 2020 ever happened. And one of the things that occurred to me is that the two most experienced party leaders at the next election, whenever it happens, will be Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh. That you have lost the virtue of novelty, and that you are now one of the most experienced leaders in this parliament. Does that change the logistics for you? Does that change your calculations?
Well, we just look at this as an opportunity to keep on fighting for people. And I'm proud that we were able to run a campaign in 2019 that really centered on people, and we put forward really bold ideas about how we can take better care of each other. So I'm hoping to do the same in the election. When it happens, it will happen at some point. I want to show Canadians we've got a record of having fought for people and having won for people. And the Bloc and the Conservatives simply haven't. Whether it's a lack of experience or a lack of caring, they haven't centered their attacks or their focus on getting anything done for people. And so that's going to be something that Canadians can make a choice with. And with respect to the Liberal government, people have seen that they were unwilling to do things, and we fought and achieved them. They were willing to let people behind, Canadians living with disabilities or seniors, and it was New Democrats that fought for them. Students were ignored by this government until the student movement actually raised this issue. And then we, based on their advocacy, said, well, we need to get help out to students, and we're able to achieve that. So I'm hoping Canadians see us as the fighters for them, that we have cared about them and we have fought for them, and we have succeeded in obtaining victories for them. And I'm hoping that we can share that message whenever the next election is.
Okay. That sounds like a natural cue for my outro. I can tell that your messaging game is in top shape. And I am grateful, Jagmeet Singh, that you've taken the time once again to come and join us. I know the Canadians will have a lot of questions about the news that you've shared with us today. As a matter of fact, I think you heard earlier someone called with a question while we were chatting. Thanks also to our sponsors from the Canadian Bankers Association. Thanks to everyone at home. I want to wish everyone a happy holiday. Stay home, stay safe, and we'll see you all in the new year. Thanks very much.
Thank you.